Well, G20 finance ministers have reached a deal to set a global minimum tax rate, specifically at 15%. That framework now goes to G20 leaders who are set to gather later this year in October. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Brian Cheung, who is following this one for us. And Brian, we talked about this last week, that this was largely expected, but there are still a lot of hurdles to get it passed domestically. Here in the U.S., we're talking about Congress that could potentially get in the way.
Absolutely. Well, cause for celebration in Italy over the weekend, not just because of the Euro outcome, but because of that agreement in spirit among those G20 finance ministers for a global minimum tax that happened as part of those G20 discussions, which occurred in Venice, Italy. Now, the communique from the conclusion of that meeting noted that the G20 finance ministers, quote, endorsed the key components of the proposal. There are two pillars that are part of this. First, there's an effective global minimum tax, which they said would be at least 15%. We don't know what the final number is going to be. And then the second pillar, which is the reallocation of profits specifically for multinational companies. This is kind of a little bit of a more challenging question because a company could be headquartered in one country, but then ultimately have IP in other countries. So how do you deal with the taxes when you do have multiple taxing rights because of the domicile of multiple countries? So the second may be more challenging, but even the first pillar, when we talk about that minimum 15% tax rate, might also be controversial when you consider the likes of Ireland, for example. They have a 12.5% corporate tax rate. Hungary has a 9% corporate tax rate. These are two countries that have voiced their opposition specifically to this type of global minimum tax, which could set up a very interesting discussion in the next few months as each of these countries tries to go back to the drawing board in their own individual countries, including the U.S. with Congress, and then try to come back to the table at the next G20 meeting, which I believe will happen in Rome. That'll be scheduled for October. And that's really where they hope to have something more of a detailed plan beyond what they already kind of voice agreed to in that meeting this weekend, Kiko.
And Brian, obviously, global minimum tax rate, not the only topic on the agenda. There was a lot of discussion about where the economic recovery stands right now, especially at a time when a lot of these G20 countries are seeing an uptick in COVID cases from the Delta variant. What did we hear more on that front this weekend?
Well, as you mentioned, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, so that was a very hot topic in the G20 meeting among a list of other discussions as well. But the communique from the G20 noting, quote, the recovery is characterized by great divergences across and within countries and remains exposed to downside risks. And they cited the Delta variant, which has become pretty prominent across Europe and even in some parts of the United States here now as one of those downside risks. Now, they acknowledge that there's a task force that's being put together by the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization on COVID-19 vaccines. We know that availability of those vaccines and even diagnostic testing in many cases has been particularly difficult in a lot of those third world developing and emerging market countries. Now, whether or not the advanced nations which comprise the G20 can do anything about that remains an open question. We know that the COVAX facility, which the World Bank, the IMF, had tried to champion, has not necessarily been as effective as a lot of the nations would have liked it to be. So, of course, we need to see what's going to happen. That next meeting in October will also see, they hope, some sort of more detailed plan on how to increase the availability of those vaccines. But of course, as we know, October is many months away, and who knows what the COVID picture looks like in 3 months from now.
Yeah, a lot of questions about how rapidly the Delta variant is spreading. So we'll be watching that one closely. Thanks so much for that, Brian.